November 14, 1957. Just past noon, a quiet farmhouse in Appalachian, New York. Vito Genovese, freshly crowned boss of bosses. History calls this his greatest triumph, the day his power became official. What happened inside that farmhouse never survived the afternoon. Behind that gap sits the real Vito Genovese story, worse than Goodfellas ever showed. Section 1. The Boy from Tufino. Vito Genovese was born on November 21, 1897, in a small hamlet called Resigliano, part of the town of Tufino, in the province of Naples, in the Campania region of southern Italy. His father was Felice Genovese, and his mother was Nunziata Aluato. Vito was one of 4 children. He had 2 brothers, Michael and Carmine, and a sister named Giovanna, who went by Jenny. The part of Italy where Vito was born was poor, and it had been poor for generations. Southern Italy in the late 1800s was made up mostly of small farms. Many of them worked by the same families for generations, split into smaller and smaller plots each time land was divided among children. There was little industry in the region, few jobs outside of farming, and almost no way for a family to build any real savings. On top of that, southern Italy had spent decades dealing with crop failures, outbreaks of disease, and heavy taxes brought in after Italy became a unified country in the 1860s. For millions of families in this part of the country, staying meant staying poor. Leaving meant at least the chance of something better. This is why, between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, so many families from southern Italy made the same choice the Genoveses eventually made. Historians often call this period the height of the Italian mass migration. Between 1900 and 1910 alone, roughly 2 million people left Italy for the United States, and the overwhelming majority came from the poorer southern regions, including Campania, Sicily, Calabria, and Abruzzo. Entire villages sometimes emptied out over the course of a few years, as men left first to find work and send money home, followed later by wives, children, and elderly relatives once enough money had been saved for the crossing. Steamship companies operating out of Naples actively competed for this business, since the fare for a single steerage ticket, while cheap compared to first or second class, still added up to real money when multiplied across an entire family. Agents in small towns like Tufino often worked on commission to convince families that America offered a better future than the land they already knew. Millions of people left villages just like Resigliano and Tufino and crossed the Atlantic Ocean, most of them heading straight for New York City, which by that point had become the single largest point of entry for Italian immigrants in the entire country. In 1913, when Vito was 15 years old, his family made that same crossing. They boarded a steamship called the SS Taormina and sailed for New York. Ships like the Taormina ran regular routes between Italy and the United States in this era, and by 1913, steamship lines had turned the Naples to New York, crossing into one of the most heavily traveled immigrant routes in the world. A trip on a vessel like the Taormina typically took somewhere between 12 and 16 days, depending on weather and how many stops the ship made along the way. Most immigrant families, including the Genoveses, traveled in what was called steerage, the cheapest class of ticket available. Steerage passengers were usually separated by sex for sleeping arrangements, with single men in one section and families or single women in another. Meals were served from large communal pots, often simple foods like soup, bread, and salted fish, since ships had no real way to keep produce or fresh meat from spoiling over a 2-week voyage. Seasickness was common, sanitation was poor, and outbreaks of illness could spread quickly through the crowded lower decks, which is part of the reason health inspections became such a serious part of the arrival process once a ship reached American shores. It was not a pleasant trip, but for families trying to reach America, it was the only trip they could afford. When immigrant ships arrived in New York Harbor in this period, first and second class passengers were typically inspected on board and released quickly, while steerage passengers, including families like the Genoveses, were ferried to Ellis Island for a more thorough round of screening. Doctors working for the United States Public Health Service conducted rapid physical inspections, often lasting only a few seconds per person, checking for visible signs of disease, physical disability, or mental illness that might disqualify someone from entry. One particular concern at the time was a contagious eye disease called trachoma, and inspectors were trained to quickly flip back a person's eyelid using a small metal hook to check for it, a procedure immigrants of the era came to dread. Anyone flagged during this process had a letter chalked onto their clothing corresponding to a suspected condition, and those individuals were pulled aside for additional examination, sometimes resulting in delayed entry, or, in rarer and more serious cases, deportation back to their home country. Most healthy immigrants, a group the Genovese family would have belonged to, passed through this entire process in a matter of hours, though the experience of standing in long lines inside the massive registry hall, surrounded by thousands of exhausted strangers speaking dozens of different languages, remained a vivid and often overwhelming memory for those who lived through it. Officials at Ellis Island also checked names against ship manifests and reviewed paperwork before clearing people to leave. For a family like the Genoveses, most of whom had probably never left their home region before, stepping off a ship into that kind of processing system would have been an overwhelming introduction to their new country. Once cleared, the Genovese family settled in Little Italy, in the section of Manhattan built up around Mulberry Street. The neighborhood they moved into had been shaped by decades of earlier reform efforts that had only partially succeeded. New York State had passed a law known as the Tenement House Act back in 1901, specifically aimed at improving conditions in buildings like the ones lining Mulberry Street, requiring things like better ventilation, indoor plumbing, and fire escapes in any new construction. The problem was that most of the buildings already standing in neighborhoods like Little Italy had been built well before this law existed, and enforcement of retroactive improvements was inconsistent at best. Photographers and reporters working in the years just before the Genoveses arrived, most notably a journalist named Jacob Riis, had already documented the overcrowded, poorly lit conditions inside these older tenements, describing inner rooms that received no direct sunlight at all, and hallways shared by dozens of families using a single set of toilets. By the time Vito's family arrived in 1913, some improvements had reached parts of the neighborhood, but many of the oldest buildings, including plenty that immigrant families like the Genoveses would have lived in, still fell short of the newer standards. By 1913, Little Italy was one of the most crowded neighborhoods in the entire city. Tenement buildings, often 5 or 6 stories tall, lined block after block. Families were commonly packed into just 2 or 3 rooms, sometimes with extended relatives or boarders sharing the same small space to help cover rent. Outside, the streets were just as packed. Pushcart vendors lined the sidewalks selling produce, bread, fish, and secondhand goods, and the noise of vendors calling out prices, mixed with the sound of Italian dialects from villages all over the old country. For a family that had just left a quiet farming hamlet in Campania, this kind of dense, loud, crowded city life would have been almost nothing like anything they had known before. Vito did not take much to school. He reached only about a 5th grade level of education before he stopped attending. This was not unusual for immigrant children in neighborhoods like Little Italy at the time. Many families depended on their children to start working or bringing in money as early as possible, and formal schooling was often seen as a luxury that a poor family could not fully afford to prioritize. Child labor was common in this era, both in factories and on the streets, and plenty of boys Vito's age were already working in some capacity well before they reached their teenage years. Instead of finishing school, Vito spent more and more of his time out on the streets of Little Italy, and it did not take long before that time turned into trouble. His first steps into crime were small and unremarkable, the kind of thing many boys in the neighborhood did at one point or another. He and his brothers took part in petty theft, including stealing from the pushcart vendors who filled Mulberry Street every day. Pushcart theft was common enough in poor immigrant neighborhoods of this era that it barely registered as serious crime to most people living there. Boys would grab fruit, bread, or small goods when a vendor's back was turned, sell what they could, and move on. It was low stakes and low risk, but for a boy like Vito, it was also an early lesson in taking what he wanted without asking. As he got a little older, Vito moved from petty theft into something closer to actual organized crime, even if it was still small time by the standards of what he would later become. He began working as an errand boy for older men already involved in local rackets. This kind of work usually meant running messages between men who did not want to be seen talking to each other directly, keeping watch while something illegal happened nearby, or handling small jobs that needed a young pair of hands and a mouth that knew how to stay shut. This was a fairly standard way for teenage boys in Little Italy to get noticed by older criminals. It let those older men test whether a boy could be trusted and whether he had the nerve for bigger jobs down the line. From there, Vito took on debt collection work. In neighborhoods like Little Italy, many residents could not get loans through banks. either because they lacked documentation, credit history, or simply because banks were not interested in lending to poor immigrant families. This created a steady demand for informal lenders, and those lenders needed people willing to collect when a borrower fell behind. Collecting on those debts often meant using threats, and sometimes it meant using actual force. This kind of work suited Vito well. By most accounts from people who knew him during these years, he already had a short temper and a willingness to use violence that set him apart from a lot of the other boys running the same streets. He also became involved in the numbers racket, an illegal lottery game that was extremely popular in poor and working-class neighborhoods across New York City in the early 1900s. The way the numbers game worked was simple enough that almost anyone could take part. A person would place a small bet, sometimes just a few cents, on a set of numbers. Later in the day, a winning number would be drawn, often based on something that was public and hard to fake, like the final digits of the total money bet at a horse race track that day. If a person's numbers matched, they won a payout that could be many times larger than what they had bet. For families who had no spare income to gamble at a casino or invest in anything real, the numbers game was one of the only ways to take a small chance at a big payoff. That popularity meant whoever controlled the numbers game in a neighborhood controlled a steady, reliable stream of cash, which made it one of the most valuable rackets a young criminal could get close to. By his late teenage years, Vito had built a small but real reputation for himself in Little Italy. He was known as someone who would use violence without much hesitation, and in a neighborhood full of small street gangs competing for control over pushcart turf, gambling spots, and loan territory, that kind of reputation carried real weight. Being seen as tough and dependable was often the fastest way for a young man to move up in that world, since older criminals were far more interested in someone who could be trusted to handle a violent situation than someone who simply followed orders quietly. Vito's growing name for violence was starting to catch the attention of men who ran operations far bigger than pushcart theft and neighborhood debt collection. At the same time, New York's Italian-American underworld was going through changes of its own. Men like Giuseppe Masseria, known on the street as Joe the Boss, were pulling together what had once been smaller, scattered street gangs into larger, more organized criminal groups. These groups ran gambling operations and loan rackets, and within a few years, once Prohibition began in 1920, they would move heavily into bootlegging as well, turning the illegal sale of alcohol into one of the most profitable businesses in the entire city. For a young man like Vito, someone already known on the street, and already comfortable with violence, this growing and increasingly organized underworld offered a clear path forward, one that would soon pull him out of small-time theft on Mulberry Street and into the center of New York's most powerful criminal circles. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before any of that happened though, Vito was still just one more tough kid from Little Italy. But the pieces of the man he would become were already falling into place. He had grown up poor in rural Italy, crossed the ocean as a teenager, left school early, and learned to survive on the streets of one of the most crowded immigrant neighborhoods in the country. He had built a name for himself through theft, debt collection, and a willingness to turn to violence faster than most. What happened next would put him directly in the path of the men who were about to turn New York's underworld into something far bigger, far more organized, and far more dangerous than anything Little Italy had seen before. Section 2. Apprentice to Joe the Boss. In 1920, the United States made the sale, production, and transport of alcohol illegal. The ban came from the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in January 1919, and the actual enforcement rules were spelled out in a law called the Volstead Act, which took effect that October and gave federal agents the power to prosecute anyone making, selling, or transporting alcoholic beverages. This ban, known as Prohibition, was supposed to clean up American cities. Instead, it created one of the largest black markets in the country's history. People still wanted to drink, and criminal groups across the country stepped in to supply them. The bootlegging economy that grew out of this ban worked through a few main channels. Some operators ran illegal breweries and distilleries hidden inside warehouses, apartment buildings, or rural farms, brewing beer or distilling liquor far from the eyes of federal agents. Others smuggled liquor in from outside the country entirely, often by ship. A well-known method involved boats anchoring just past the 3-mile limit of American territorial waters, an area that came to be nicknamed Rum Row, where smaller, faster boats would meet them at night to ferry cases of liquor back to shore, before federal Coast Guard patrols could catch them. Along the northern border, liquor was smuggled down from Canada, where alcohol remained legal, using trucks, cars, and even small aircraft to move product across largely unguarded stretches of land. Once liquor reached a city, it needed somewhere to be sold, and that demand gave rise to speakeasies, hidden bars, and clubs that operated behind unmarked doors, often requiring a password or a nod from a doorman who recognized a regular customer. Making and moving liquor illegally turned into a business worth enormous sums of money almost overnight, and criminal organizations that had once been small, scattered, and mostly focused on gambling and loan rackets suddenly had access to a level of wealth they had never seen before. For a young man like Vito Genovese, already working his way up through the underworld of Little Italy, this new bootlegging economy offered a direct path into the biggest and most profitable criminal organization in the city. That organization belonged to Giuseppe Masseria, a Sicilian immigrant who had spent nearly 2 decades clawing his way to the top of New York's underworld. Masseria had come to the United States around 1902, still a teenager, and had joined the Morello gang in East Harlem soon after, working as an enforcer and taking part in burglaries. The Morello gang itself had a long history by the time Masseria joined it, tracing back to Giuseppe Morello, a Sicilian immigrant sometimes called the clutch hand because of a deformed right hand, who had built one of the very first organized Italian criminal groups in New York during the 1890s and early 1900s, running counterfeiting operations and extortion rackets out of East Harlem. Morello's own influence had been temporarily broken when he was convicted on federal counterfeiting charges and sent to prison in 1910, a setback that left his gang in disarray and opened the door for ambitious younger men, Masseria among them, to fight for control of what remained of the organization. Masseria was convicted of burglary in 1909 and received a suspended sentence, then was convicted again a few years later and sent to prison for 4 to 6 years. After his release, Masseria fought in a violent conflict known as the Mafia Camorra War, which ran from 1915 to 1917 and pitted Sicilian gangsters against rival Italian gangs from Naples and Campania known as the Camorra. The Camorra had its own long criminal tradition stretching back to Naples itself, and its presence in New York reflected the same regional rivalries that existed back in Italy, transplanted directly onto the streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan. Masseria came out of that war with a serious reputation, and by the early 1920s, after years of internal power struggles among New York's Italian gangs, he had risen to become the dominant mafia boss in the city, taking the title of Boss of Bosses following the death of a previous rival leader named Salvatore D'Aquila in 1928. By the late 1920s, Masseria controlled the largest and most powerful Italian-American crime organization in New York, one that pulled in men from Sicily, Calabria, and Campania. His operation ran gambling, loan sharking, and after 1920, an enormous and growing bootlegging business built around smuggling and distributing illegal liquor. It was into this organization that Vito Genovese had worked his way during the 1920s, building on the reputation for violence and reliability he had already earned as a teenager in Little Italy. By the time Prohibition was in full swing, Genovese had become one of Masseria's trusted men, part of an inner circle that also included Charles Luciano, Albert Anastasia, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Willie Moretti, and Alfred Mineo. Luciano's path into Masseria's world had started years earlier, and in a very different way than Genovese's. Luciano had been born in Sicily and immigrated to New York as a child, growing up in the Five Points neighborhood of Lower Manhattan rather than in a Sicilian criminal tradition. As a boy on the Lower East Side, he became friends with a Jewish immigrant named Meyer Lansky, and through Lansky he also came to know Benjamin Siegel, who would later be known as Bugsy. As they all grew older, Luciano moved into Masseria's Italian gang, while Lansky and Siegel built their own connections in New York's Jewish criminal underworld. These early friendships across ethnic lines would end up mattering a great deal, since Luciano would later call on both Lansky and Siegel for help with jobs that Masseria's more old-fashioned Sicilian gangsters might not have trusted outsiders to handle. It was within Masseria's organization that Genovese and Luciano formed the partnership that would define both of their futures. The two men were close in age and shared a similar outlook that set them apart from the older generation running the mafia at the time. Men like Masseria and his rivals had grown up under strict old-world Sicilian traditions and expected everyone beneath them to follow those same rules without question. This older style of leadership became known, somewhat mockingly, as the way of the mustache Petes, a term used for old-school bosses who wore old-fashioned mustaches and ran their operations the way things had always been done back in Sicily. These bosses often refused to do business with anyone who was not Italian, looked down on gangsters from regions other than their own, and treated tradition as more important than opportunity. Genovese, Luciano, Costello, and the other younger men around them saw this thinking as a serious limit on how much money and power they could build. They had grown up on the streets of New York rather than in Sicilian villages, and they were far more interested in doing business with anyone who could help them make money, regardless of where that person's family had come from. Luciano's own friendships with Lansky and Siegel were a perfect example of the kind of partnership the older Sicilian bosses would never have allowed. To the younger generation, the constant feuding and rigid loyalty demanded by men like Masseria looked less like honorable tradition and more like a waste of manpower and money that could otherwise be spent growing the business. While Genovese and Luciano worked their way up inside Masseria's organization, a serious rival to Masseria's power was taking shape. A Sicilian mafioso named Salvatore Maranzano had been sent to the United States from his hometown of Castellammare del Golfo to challenge Masseria's control over the city's underworld. Before coming to America, Maranzano had reportedly studied for the priesthood in Sicily and was known among his own followers for a deep interest in ancient Roman history, particularly the career of Julius Caesar, a subject he apparently enjoyed discussing at length. Maranzano built his own faction largely out of fellow immigrants from that same Sicilian town, including men like Joseph Bonanno, Stefano Magaddino, Joseph Profaci, and Joe Aiello. Tensions between Masseria's people and Maranzano's people had been building for a couple of years before the fighting turned deadly, including repeated disputes over bootlegging territory, with each side sometimes hijacking the other's liquor shipments. Masseria did not help his own position during this time. As his power grew, he began demanding money tributes from other mafia gangs around the country, a move that made him enemies well beyond New York. Other mobsters at the time accused Masseria of ordering the murders of two men in 1930, Gaspar Milazzo in Detroit and Gaetano Reina in the Bronx, both of whom were seen as threats or obstacles to his growing control. These killings, and the resentment they caused, helped set the stage for the war that was about to consume New York's underworld for more than a year. The conflict that became known as the Castellammare War is usually dated as beginning on February 26, 1930, with the murder of Gaetano Reina. Reina had led a smaller but still significant crime family that controlled rackets in the Bronx and Harlem, including the local ice distribution business, which mattered a great deal at a time when ice was still needed in most homes to keep food from spoiling. His death, and the suspicion that Masseria himself had ordered it, set off a chain of retaliation between the two factions that would stretch on for well over a year. As the war continued, Masseria's side began suffering serious losses. On August 15, 1930, Giuseppe Morello, the same man whose gang had given Masseria his start decades earlier, and who had since become one of Masseria's key advisors and a strategist for his side of the fight, was killed, along with an associate named Joseph Periano, while collecting cash at his office in East Harlem. Morello had been one of the most experienced men guiding Masseria's war effort, and his death was a heavy blow to Masseria's leadership, closing out a criminal career that stretched back to the earliest days of organized Italian crime in New York. A few months later, on November 5, 1930, two more of Masseria's men, Alfred Mineo and Steve Ferrigno, were murdered as well. After that killing, a man named Francesco Scallas took control of Mineo's old gang and then defected entirely to join Maranzano's side, a clear sign that Masseria's grip on his own people was starting to fall apart. By February 3, 1931, another important Masseria lieutenant, Joseph Catania, was shot and died from his wounds 2 days later. These losses did more than weaken Masseria's side on paper. They exposed just how fragile loyalty could become inside a criminal organization once things started going badly. Many of Masseria's men, watching their own leadership get killed off one after another, began quietly switching sides to join Maranzano instead. What had started as a clear war between two organized factions was turning into something far messier, where the original battle lines barely mattered anymore, and staying alive was driving most of the decisions being made by men on both sides. Watching this unfold, Luciano and Genovese understood exactly which way the war was heading. Rather than stay loyal to a boss who looked increasingly likely to lose everything, the two men opened secret communication with Maranzano. The arrangement they worked out was simple and direct. Luciano and Genovese would arrange to have Masseria killed themselves, ending the fight from within Masseria's own camp, and in exchange, Maranzano would agree to stop the fighting and bring the conflict to a close the moment Masseria was gone. It was a decision that would completely rewrite the balance of power in New York's underworld, but it was also, in the most direct sense possible, a betrayal of the man who had helped both of them rise. Masseria had trusted Luciano and Genovese as two of his closest and most capable men. Genovese in particular had spent years building his reputation inside Masseria's organization, working his way up from a young enforcer known for violence into one of the boss's most relied-upon lieutenants. That same trust Masseria had placed in them was now about to be turned directly against him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the spring of 1931, everything was in place for that betrayal to be carried out. Masseria had no idea that two of his own men he had personally helped raise up through the ranks of his organization, were now working hand in hand with the very enemy he had spent more than a year fighting. What happened next would unfold over a single afternoon, inside a quiet restaurant on the edge of Coney Island, and it would end Masseria's life while clearing the way for Luciano and Genovese to become two of the most powerful men in American organized crime. Section 3. The Dinner That Killed Masseria. By the spring of 1931, the Castellamarese War had gone on for more than a year, and Giuseppe Masseria was losing. His most experienced men had been shot down one after another, several of his own captains had defected to the other side, and the organization he had spent nearly 2 decades building was falling apart from the inside. Behind his back, two of the men he trusted most, Charles Luciano and Vito Genovese, had already struck a secret deal with the rival boss, Salvatore Maranzano. Luciano and Genovese would arrange to have Masseria killed themselves, and in exchange, Maranzano would agree to end the war the moment Masseria was gone. The plan came together on April 15, 1931. Luciano and Genovese would a restaurant called Nuova Via Tamaro, located at 2715 West 15th Street in Coney Island, Brooklyn. Coney Island in 1931 was known across the city as a place for entertainment and cheap, easy escape from the pressures of daily life, home to amusement parks, boardwalk arcades, and a string of small Italian restaurants that catered to both local families and, quietly, to men in the rackets who wanted a meal somewhere removed from the busier streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn. Nuova Villa Tamaro fit that second category well. It was one of Masseria's favorite places to eat, a quiet Italian seafood restaurant, far removed from the pressure of the ongoing war raging across the city. Masseria arrived that afternoon in his armored car, along with bodyguards, comfortable enough in the setting and the company to let his guard down for a few hours. According to newspaper accounts from the time, Masseria reached the restaurant shortly before 3 in the afternoon. Once inside, Masseria and Luciano ate a long meal together, and afterward, the two men settled in for a game of cards. Reports describe them playing pinochle, passing a quiet afternoon the way they often did, eating, drinking, and taking a break from the tension of the war outside. The restaurant's owner, Gerardo Scarpato, had his mother-in-law wait in the kitchen while he stepped away from the building entirely. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary lunch between a boss and one of his closest men. At some point during the card game, Luciano got up from the table and excused himself, saying he needed to use the bathroom. This was the signal. Almost as soon as Luciano left the room, gunmen entered the restaurant. According to reporting from the New York Times shortly after the killing, witnesses described two well-dressed young men pulling up outside in a car, walking into the restaurant without any urgency, and opening fire almost immediately after entering. Over the years, gangland histories have often named 4 men as the shooters involved: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Siegel, known on the street as Bugsy. It is worth being clear that the original police reports and newspaper coverage from 1931 only described 2 gunmen at the scene, and neither the New York Times nor the New York Herald Tribune named Luciano as present at all in their initial coverage, even though police brought him in afterward for questioning. The names that have since become attached to the hit come mostly from gangland legend, passed down over the following decades, not from the official record at the time. Whoever pulled the triggers, the shooting itself was violent and fast. Witnesses reported that somewhere around 20 shots were fired inside the restaurant, coming from a mix of 32 and 38 caliber pistols. Masseria was hit 5 times in total, 4 bullets striking him in the back and 1 in the back of the head. His body slammed forward onto the table before falling to the floor. After the shooting stopped, the gunman walked out of the restaurant calmly, showing no sign of panic, got into a waiting car, and drove away. Police later recovered 2 revolvers discarded in an alley next to the building. One detail from the crime scene became especially famous in the years that followed. Photographs taken after the shooting show Masseria's body on the floor with the ace of spades playing card resting in his hand, a card long associated in popular imagination with death. The truth behind that image is far less dramatic than the legend built around it. Masseria had been in the middle of a hand of pinnacle when he was shot, and researchers who have studied the case, including historians at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, believe the ace of spades was likely placed in his hand afterward, possibly by a press photographer looking to make the photo more striking for publication. It is a reminder that even well-known details from famous mob killings can end up being partly manufactured after the fact, rather than reflecting exactly what happened in the moment. In the hours and days after the shooting, police tried to piece together who was responsible. Investigators initially focused their suspicion on a gangster named John Giustra, known on the street as Silk Stockings, after an informant's tip and a coat left behind at the crime scene appeared to connect him to the killing. That lead went nowhere. Giustra himself was murdered on July 9, 1931, less than 3 months after Masseria's death, and with him gone, the case against him and anyone else fell apart for lack of evidence. Luciano, despite being questioned by police, was never charged. In the end, no one was ever arrested or convicted for the murder of Giuseppe Masseria. The case remains officially unsolved to this day, even though gangland history has long treated the broader outline of what happened, and who benefited from it, as common knowledge. Masseria was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, one of the largest cemeteries in the country, and the resting place of a large number of New York's Italian immigrant population, going back generations, closing out a criminal career that had stretched back to his teenage years as a burglar in the Morello gang, and had carried him all the way to the top of New York's mafia underworld, before ending in a Coney Island seafood restaurant at the age of 45. His death marked the end of the Castellamarese War almost immediately. True to the deal struck beforehand, Salvatore Maranzano declared the fighting over now that his rival was dead, and he moved quickly to reorganize New York's criminal underworld under his own control. In the aftermath, Maranzano restructured the city's Italian-American mafia into what became known as the Five Families, dividing New York's organized crime operations into separate, clearly defined organizations, rather than one sprawling structure fighting for total control. The 5 organizations that emerged from this reorganization were led respectively by Luciano, taking over Masseria's old operation, Joseph Profaci, Tommy Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, and Maranzano himself, who kept control of his own Castellamarese-based faction. These 5 organizations would later become known, after further changes in leadership over the following decades, by the family names still used by historians and law enforcement today. Maranzano himself took the title of Capo di tutti capi, meaning boss of all bosses, positioning himself as the supreme authority over the entire New York mafia structure. For Vito Genovese, the killing had paid off just as planned. His role in helping remove Masseria, along with his standing as one of Luciano's closest and most trusted men, elevated him into one of the top positions inside Luciano's newly independent family, a long way from the pushcart thefts and small-time debt collecting that had defined his teenage years on Mulberry Street. Some later retellings of this period describe the fall of Masseria and the older Sicilian bosses as part of a larger, coordinated purge, sometimes claiming that dozens of old-world mafiosi were killed across the country within a matter of days as the younger generation seized total control. Modern historians who have studied police and newspaper records from 1931 have generally found little solid evidence to support the idea that such a large, organized purge actually took place on the scale the legend describes. What the record does support clearly is the death of Masseria himself, the reorganization that followed under Maranzano, and the rapid rise of Luciano and Genovese within the new structure. The more dramatic version of events, involving a single coordinated night of killings nationwide, appears to belong more to gangland storytelling than to verified history. The killing of Joe Masseria is often described by historians as the moment the American mafia began shifting away from its old-world roots and towards something closer to a modern criminal business. Masseria and the generation of bosses he represented had built their power on strict Sicilian tradition, treating loyalty to the old ways as more important than opportunity or profit. Luciano, Genovese, and the younger men who orchestrated Masseria's death had shown, in the most direct way possible, that they were willing to set tradition aside completely when it stood in the way of their own advancement. It was a lesson that would not be lost on the men now running New York's underworld, including Maranzano himself, who had just taken power in large part because two of his rivals' own lieutenants had turned on their boss without hesitation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That lesson would not take long to matter again. Almost as soon as Maranzano settled into his new position as boss of all bosses, he began to see Luciano and Genovese not as men who had helped him win the war, but as a threat to his own authority. Rumors soon began reaching Luciano that Maranzano was already making plans of his own, plans that involved having both Luciano and Genovese removed the same way Masseria had been. The same tactics that had carried the two men to the top of Luciano's family were about to be turned toward an entirely new target, and this time, Genovese would help decide the fate of the very boss who had just declared himself ruler of them all. Section 4. The Boccia Murder and the Flight to Italy. After Joe Masseria was killed in April 1931, Salvatore Maranzano took control of the New York Mafia and declared himself boss of all bosses. He wasted little time consolidating power, reorganizing the city's Italian-American underworld into what became known as the Five Families, giving Luciano's old organization, the one that had belonged to Masseria, its own independent standing under Luciano's leadership. On paper, this arrangement should have settled things. In practice, Maranzano quickly began to see Luciano and Genovese, the same two men who had just helped him win the war, as the biggest threat to his own new position at the top. Maranzano's suspicion was not unfounded. He had watched Luciano and Genovese turn on their own boss once already, and he understood better than most how quickly loyalty could shift in this world, once someone became inconvenient. According to multiple historical accounts, Maranzano began making arrangements to have both men killed, reportedly reaching out to an Irish gangster named Vincent Call, known on the street as Mad Dog, to carry out the job. Before that plan could move forward, word reached Luciano through Tommy Lucchese, one of Maranzano's own men, who warned him that he and Genovese were marked for death. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano summoned Luciano and Genovese to come to his office, located on the 9th floor of a building at 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan, now known as the Helmsley Building. The building itself had only been completed a few years earlier, in 1929, originally called the New York Central Building, because of its connection to the railroad company, whose tracks ran directly beneath it, and it was considered one of the more impressive office towers in Manhattan at the time, with an ornate gold-capped roof designed to be visible for blocks in either direction along Park Avenue. Maranzano ran his legitimate front business, a real estate concern called the Eagle Building Corporation, out of an office there, using the respectable address to project the image of a successful businessman rather than a mob boss. Convinced that the meeting was a trap, Luciano decided to strike first instead of walking into it. Rather than send anyone from his own crew, Luciano arranged for a group of gunmen who had no connection to the Italian mafia and whose faces would be unfamiliar to Maranzano's people. These men were secured with help from Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, both of whom Luciano had known since childhood on the Lower East Side. On the afternoon of September 10th, a group described in various accounts as somewhere between 4 and 6 men entered the building at 230 Park Avenue and made their way up to the 9th floor office of the Eagle Building Corporation, which served as the front for Maranzano's operation. Once inside, the men flashed badges at the secretary, claiming to be government agents there to conduct an official raid, and forced several other people waiting in the office against a wall. When they reached Maranzano's private office, a struggle broke out. Maranzano was stabbed multiple times in the chest, stomach, and face, then shot several more times before the killers fled the building. Reports at the time noted that Vincent Call, the hired gun Maranzano had reportedly brought in to kill Luciano, arrived at the building for his own scheduled meeting only after the assassins were already gone. In the days following the killing, a reporter discovered an address book near the building that was believed to belong to Maranzano. The book reportedly contained between 30 and 50 names, including some prominent figures such as judges and immigration officials, and it fed early theories that the murder might have been connected to an immigrant smuggling operation Maranzano was running on the side. Investigators also explored possible links to narcotics trafficking and to Al Capone's organization in Chicago, since hats recovered from the crime scene reportedly carried labels from Chicago stores. In the end, much like the investigation into Masseria's murder 5 months earlier, the case against Maranzano's killers went nowhere. Luciano was never charged, and no one was ever convicted for the killing. With Maranzano dead, Luciano moved quickly to reshape the structure of the American mafia in a way that was meant to prevent this exact cycle of betrayal and bloodshed from repeating itself. He helped establish a governing body known as the Commission, made up of leaders from the major crime families, designed to settle disputes between families through negotiation rather than open warfare. In practice, the Commission functioned something like a board of directors, with representatives from the major families expected to meet periodically to discuss issues affecting organized crime as a whole, including territorial disputes, disagreements over rackets that crossed family lines, and requests from one family to take action against a member of another. A boss who wanted to kill a rival boss was, in theory, supposed to bring the matter before the Commission first and receive approval, rather than acting alone the way Masseria and Maranzano effectively had. This did not eliminate violence from the world of organized crime, but it gave the leading families a shared framework for managing conflict that had not existed before, and it reflected the same practical, business-minded thinking that separated Luciano's generation from the men they had just replaced. Under this new system, no single man held the title of boss of all bosses the way Masseria and Maranzano once had. Instead, power was meant to be shared among the heads of the 5 families, with the Commission acting as a kind of board that could approve or reject major decisions, including whether a hit on another boss should be allowed to happen at all. Genovese's position rose sharply in the aftermath of both killings. His role in removing Masseria, followed by his part in the plot against Maranzano, had proven his value to Luciano beyond question. Genovese became one of Luciano's top men inside the newly organized family, overseeing rackets that included gambling operations, loan sharking, and the kind of racketeering schemes that had become the backbone of organized crime income during this period. His personal life was moving forward as well. On March 30th, 1932, Genovese married Giovannina Petillo, who went by Anna, in New York. It was the second marriage for both of them. Anna's first husband had been murdered only days before she and Vito were wed, a detail that reflected just how tightly her own life was already bound up in the same violent world Genovese moved through. Anna went on to run nightclubs and bars in Manhattan in the years that followed, some of them operating well outside whatever the mafia considered its official business, and by some accounts, she became a fairly well-known figure in her own right within the city's nightlife scene, particularly in Greenwich Village, where a number of the venues she was connected to catered to a mixed clientele that included members of the city's emerging gay nightlife community, an unusual detail for the wife of a mafia boss during this period, and one that set her apart from the far more private roles most mob wives of the era were expected to keep. Genovese spent the first half of the 1930s building his standing inside Luciano's organization, and it was during this period that he became entangled in the case that would eventually force him out of the country entirely. In 1934, Genovese partnered with a small-time gambler named Ferdinand Boccia, who went by the nickname The Shadow, on a scheme to cheat a wealthy gambler out of a large sum of money in a rigged card game. According to the most detailed accounts of the case, the scam brought in roughly $150,000 from the victim. Boccia, who had been the one to introduce the wealthy mark to Genovese in the first place, felt he was owed a serious cut of the winnings for setting the whole thing up, and he demanded a share reported to be around $35,000. Genovese had no intention of paying. Rather than hand over any part of the money, he decided the simplest solution was to have Boccia killed. He turned to a group of men connected to his operation to carry out the job, including a low-level mobster named Ernest Rupolo, who went by the nickname The Hawk, and had worked as a hitman for Genovese's people throughout the decade. Alongside Rupolo, Genovese also wanted another man named Willie Gallo removed, since Gallo was tied up in the same dispute over the card game money. On September 19, 1934, hitmen connected to the plot shot and killed Ferdinand Boccia inside a coffee shop in Brooklyn, on Metropolitan Avenue. The killing was carried out quickly and without much complication, and for a while, it looked like the matter had been closed for good. It did not stay closed. Years later, Ernest Rupolo was arrested on an unrelated charge, one that carried the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. Facing decades behind bars, Rupolo made the decision to cooperate with prosecutors, and as part of that cooperation, he confessed to his own role in the Boccia murder and directly implicated Genovese as the man who had ordered the killing. This should have been enough to bring serious charges against Genovese, but under the law at the time, a single witness's testimony, especially testimony coming from someone who had already confessed to being part of the crime himself, was not considered strong enough on its own to secure a conviction. Prosecutors needed a second corroborating witness to support what Rupolo was saying, and at that point in the case, they did not yet have one. By 1937, with prosecutors continuing to dig into the Boccia case and Rupolo's confession hanging over him, Genovese made the decision to leave the country rather than risk being arrested and tried for the murder. He fled to Italy, leaving behind the organization he had spent more than 2 decades building inside New York's underworld, along with the wife, rackets, and reputation he had fought so hard to establish. It was a sharp turn for a man who, just a few years earlier, had stood at Luciano's side as one of the most powerful and trusted figures in the entire American mafia. Now he was a fugitive, crossing the same ocean his family had crossed in the other direction back in 1913, headed toward a country that was, by this point, firmly under the control of a fascist government that Genovese would soon find very useful to his own interests. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The move bought Genovese time, but it did not make the Boccia case disappear. Back in the United States, the investigation into Ferdinand Boccia's murder remained open, waiting for a second witness who could confirm what Rupolo had already confessed to. Genovese, for his part, was about to spend the next several years building an entirely new set of connections in Italy, ones that would tie him directly to some of the most powerful political figures in the country, and set the stage for an entirely different kind of trouble waiting for him once the war in Europe came to an end. Section 5. Don Vito and Il Duce. When Vito Genovese fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid facing charges in the Ferdinand Boccia murder, he did not simply disappear into hiding. Instead, he settled into a new life that let him keep operating as a powerful and wealthy man, even while a fugitive from American justice. Italy at the time was firmly under the control of Benito Mussolini's fascist government, and Genovese wasted little time building connections inside that system. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, Genovese became a friend of Mussolini and financed several fascist operations during these years, all while continuing to run narcotics smuggling operations back toward the United States. This was a remarkable balancing act for a man technically wanted for murder in his home country, but Genovese had a long history of finding ways to make himself useful to whoever held power around him, and fascist Italy in the late 1930s was no exception. Back in New York, Genovese's absence did not mean his criminal empire fell apart. His operation continued running under the watch of Frank Costello, who took over as acting boss of the organization, while Genovese remained overseas. Costello had a reputation as a skilled fixer, with strong political connections of his own, and under his leadership, the rackets that Genovese had helped build kept generating money, even with Genovese thousands of miles away. This arrangement let Genovese maintain his position and his income without needing to set foot back in the country where he was a wanted man. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s and World War II spread across Europe, Genovese's situation in Italy became more complicated, but also more useful to him in unexpected ways. The United States eventually entered the war, and by 1943, American and British forces were preparing for the invasion of Sicily, the first major step toward pushing Axis forces out of Italy entirely. This planned invasion, later carried out under the military codename Operation Husky in July 1943, was one of the largest amphibious operations attempted up to that point in the war, and American planners were eager for any advantage that could reduce casualties and speed the collapse of Axis resistance on the island. According to reporting in the New York Review of Books, in the lead-up to this invasion, Genovese was among a group of criminals used by United States naval intelligence to help prepare the way for the landings, gathering military information from local contacts, and cooperating with American agents already operating in the region. This mirrored a broader, well-documented pattern from the war, in which American naval intelligence had already reached out to organized crime figures back in the United States for a related purpose, most notably Lucky Luciano himself, who, while still imprisoned in New York, reportedly cooperated with naval intelligence officers seeking to secure the city's waterfront against sabotage and gather information useful for the coming invasion of Sicily, an arrangement that later factored into the case for his own reduced sentence and eventual deportation. Genovese, already established in Italy for several years and deeply connected to local networks, fit that same general pattern well, even though he had spent the previous few years cultivating friendships with the very fascist government the Allies were now trying to overthrow. It was in the middle of this shifting and complicated period that one of the strangest and most disputed episodes connected to Genovese took place, thousands of miles away, back in New York City. On January 11, 1943, an Italian-American journalist and longtime anti-fascist activist named Carlo Tresca was shot and killed on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, near the corner of 15th Street, not far from the office of his newspaper, Il Martello. Tresca had been born in 1879 in Sulmona, a town in the Abruzzo region of Italy, and had spent decades as a vocal critic of authoritarian movements on both the political left and right after immigrating to the United States, building a reputation as one of the most outspoken radical voices in New York's Italian-American community. In 1937, he had served on a body known as the Dewey Commission, an independent panel that examined and ultimately dismissed the charges brought against the exiled Soviet revolutionary Leon Trotsky during Stalin's Moscow show trials, a role that underscored just how seriously his opinions were taken even outside Italian-American circles. In the years leading up to his death, Tresca had used his newspaper to attack former supporters of Mussolini living in the United States, as well as to criticize the mafia's influence over certain labor unions. The man widely believed to have pulled the trigger was Carmine Galante, a mafia hitman who was never officially charged in the killing. Exactly who ordered Tresca's murder, and why, has never been settled with certainty, and honest accounts of the case need to reflect that uncertainty, rather than presenting one theory as fact. One version of events, repeated in FBI records according to the Mob Museum, holds that Genovese gave the order to have Tresca killed as a favor to Mussolini's government, since Tresca's writing had become a public irritant to fascist sympathizers both in Italy and among Italian Americans in New York. A different theory, laid out by writers examining the case more recently, points instead toward Frank Garofalo, an underboss connected to the Bonanno crime family, who was closely tied to Generoso Pope, a prominent New York publisher whom Tresca had been publicly attacking in the months before his death. Under this version of events, the murder had less to do with Mussolini directly and more to do with a personal and business rivalry playing out inside New York's Italian-American community. Adding another layer of complexity, some writers have pointed out that Tresca's death came at an odd moment for the theory that it was a favor to Mussolini, since American forces were only months away from invading Sicily, and a public killing tied back to fascist sympathies could have drawn unwanted attention to the very network of Sicilian contacts the United States was quietly trying to use for its own purposes. No one has ever been convicted of Tresca's murder, and it remains an officially unsolved case to this day. Only a few months after Tresca's killing, Mussolini's own government collapsed. Facing military defeat and growing political pressure, the fascist regime was overthrown in July 1943, and Italy signed an armistice with the Allies that September, switching sides in the war. This sudden change reshaped the entire landscape Genovese had spent years building his position in. The fascist officials he had spent so much time cultivating were no longer in power, and Allied forces, including American troops, now controlled large sections of southern Italy, where Genovese had been living. Rather than treat this as a setback, Genovese adapted quickly, shifting his focus toward building relationships with the new authorities running the show, the American military occupation government. Genovese proved remarkably good at making himself useful to the Americans running occupied Italy, much the same way he had once made himself useful to the fascists before them. He took a position working as an interpreter for the U.S. Army, a job that gave him access, credibility, and movement throughout occupied areas. He also managed to collect an impressive stack of travel permits, allowing him largely unrestricted movement through occupied Italy at a time when such freedom was hard for most people to come by. On top of that, he gathered letters of recommendation from American officers praising his character. One letter, later found by investigators, went so far as to describe Genovese as absolutely honest, crediting him with helping expose cases of bribery and black market dealing among what the letter called trusted civilian personnel. This praise would turn out to be almost entirely backward, since Genovese himself was busy running one of the largest black market operations in the region. Underneath the interpreter job and the letters of praise, Genovese was operating a criminal network that stole directly from the American military supply chain. His operation took U.S. Army trucks, loaded them with stolen goods, including flour and sugar meant for military use, and moved that stolen material into Italy's black market, where wartime shortages meant enormous profits were waiting for anyone able to supply basic goods outside official channels. In at least one case, Genovese's operation recruited 2 Canadian soldiers to help carry out a theft. Those 2 soldiers were eventually arrested on June 4, 1944, and once in custody, they gave investigators the information that pointed directly back to Genovese as the man running the larger operation behind their crime. The investigation that followed was led by a U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division agent named Orange C. Dickey. Tracking Genovese down proved difficult, since by this point, he had already been fired from his interpreter position, but was still moving freely through the region and continuing to operate with little apparent fear of consequences. Dickey eventually caught up with him on August 27, 1944, in the town of Nola, a small city in the province of Naples with a history stretching back to ancient Roman times, where Genovese had gone to the office of the town mayor to request a travel permit, arriving in a chauffeur-driven car with an armed escort. While Genovese's bodyguard was busy parking the vehicle, Dickey approached him directly, accompanied by 2 English soldiers, and asked him to come along to the military police office in Nola. Genovese agreed without resistance. Afterward, Dickey searched the car Genovese had been riding in, an Italian Fiat, and found 2 loaded handguns hidden in a compartment behind the front seat. As Dickey continued building his case, an informant in Nola handed him a copy of a 1940 book called Gang Rule in New York City, written by Craig Thompson and Raymond Allen. Inside, Dickey found a photograph identifying Genovese as a former criminal associate of Lucky Luciano. When Dickey showed the photo to his prisoner, Genovese did not bother denying who he was, simply confirming that the picture showed him back when he had lived in New York City. When Dickey pressed him about running the black market, Genovese denied some of the specific accusations, while admitting to others. Dickey then reached out to the FBI, who informed him that Genovese was already wanted for questioning in connection with a murder case back in New York. The very Boccia killing Genovese had fled the country to avoid facing years earlier. A search of Genovese's apartment in Naples revealed just how well he had been living while supposedly hiding as a fugitive. Dickey later said he had never seen furnishings that lavish or a wardrobe that extensive belonging to a single man. Genovese also had a stash of expensive travel permits and a collection of glowing letters from American military officers, the same kind of documents that had helped him move freely and avoid suspicion for so long. Dickey's investigation also uncovered that Genovese had been running illegal currency exchange operations and kept a safe deposit box in Nola. By the time Dickey managed to obtain the legal authority to open it, however, a relative of Genovese had already emptied its contents, leaving investigators with one less piece of evidence to work with. Getting Genovese back to the United States to face justice turned out to be far harder than simply catching him. At one point, Dickey's superiors transferred Genovese out of a secure military police jail and into a civilian lockup in the nearby town of Avellino, another provincial capital in the region, reportedly after the name of a certain unnamed general became connected to the case in some way Dickey was never given full details about. Around the same time, Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer, who was serving as a military legal advisor in Italy during this period, and who would later go on to be elected mayor of New York City in 1945, told Dickey to stop going through normal army channels and instead reach out directly to the district attorney's office in Brooklyn if he wanted the case to actually move forward. The pattern of obstruction Dickey ran into suggested that Genovese still had influence reaching into places far above a simple black market investigation. Genovese himself tried to make the problem disappear the same way he had handled so many obstacles throughout his career, with money and intimidation. According to multiple historical accounts, he personally offered Dickey a bribe of $250,000 in exchange for simply letting the matter drop. When Dickey refused the money, Genovese reportedly threatened him directly. Dickey also faced pressure from within his own military chain of command. with some superiors suggesting he back away from pursuing the case any further. Despite all of this, Dickey refused to let the investigation die, and after months of frustration, he finally secured permission to arrange Genovese's return to New York, where he would face trial for the killing of Ferdinand Boccia a decade after it happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Getting Genovese onto a ship bound for the United States was only the beginning of the next chapter in this case, not the end of it. Back in New York, prosecutors were preparing to rely heavily on the testimony of Ernest Rupolo, the hitman who had already confessed to his own role in Boccia's murder, and named Genovese as the man who ordered it. Rupolo's word alone was not considered strong enough to convict, and the case would ultimately hinge on whether a second witness could be found to back up what he was saying. What happened to that witness, once he agreed to come forward, would turn the entire case upside down before it ever reached a verdict. Section 6. The Poisoning of a Witness. After Agent Orange Dickey finally secured permission to send Vito Genovese back to the United States, prosecutors in Brooklyn moved forward with building their case around the 10-year-old murder of Ferdinand Boccia. On August 7, 1944, while Genovese was still overseas, a Kings County grand jury had already indicted him a second time for the killing, along with a man named Michael Miranda and 4 other associates connected to the case. The heart of the prosecution's evidence rested on the confession and testimony of Ernest Rupolo, the hitman who had already admitted his own role in the murder, and directly implicated Genovese as the man who ordered it. Under the law at the time, however, the word of an accomplice like Rupolo was not enough on its own to convict someone of murder. Prosecutors needed a second, independent witness whose testimony could support what Rupolo was saying, and finding that second witness would end up shaping the entire outcome of the case. Genovese himself did not arrive back in the country right away. After his arrest in Italy in August 1944, the process of formally extraditing him took months to work through military and legal channels. It was not until June 1, 1945, that Genovese finally landed in New York Harbor aboard the steamship SS James Likes, spending the voyage handcuffed to Agent Dickey the entire way. He was arraigned the very next day, June 2, 1945, and pleaded not guilty to the murder charge. By the time he stood in that courtroom, the case against him had already lost its most important piece, even though Genovese himself did not yet know it when he first heard the announcement of his own extradition months earlier. That missing piece was a man named Peter Latempa, a Brooklyn associate connected to the Genovese crime family who had inside knowledge of the 1934 Boccia murder. Latempa had reportedly agreed to cooperate with authorities and support Rupolo's account of what happened, but his willingness to talk seems to have come, at least in part, from a belief that Genovese would likely never actually be brought to trial. As long as Genovese remained a fugitive hiding out in Italy, cooperating with prosecutors carried very little real risk for Latempa, since there was no one around for Genovese's people to protect by silencing him. That calculation changed the moment word came that Genovese was finally being sent back to the United States. On January 8, 1945, federal authorities publicly announced that Genovese's extradition was moving forward and that he would be repatriated to New York to face the murder charge. For Latempa, this announcement transformed his situation overnight. A case that had felt theoretical and safe to speak about now suddenly involved a very real, very dangerous man who was actually coming back to face trial, with Latempa's own testimony standing as one of the key pieces of evidence against him. Latempa reacted quickly. He went directly to the Brooklyn District Attorney's office and demanded to be placed in protective custody, making clear that he feared for his safety now that Genovese's return was official. Authorities granted his request. Latempa was placed in a cell at the Raymond Street Jail on January 8, 1945, the same day the extradition announcement was made. The facility, which had served Brooklyn as its main county jail since the middle of the 19th century, had a long-standing reputation as an old, crowded, and difficult institution to secure properly, having housed generations of the borough's criminal population by the time Latempa arrived there. Guards were assigned to check on him regularly as part of his protection. For a little over a week, this arrangement appeared to be working exactly as intended. Then, on the morning of January 15, 1945, Latempa was found dead in his cell. He had reportedly been taking medication to manage pain from gallstones, and at first glance, his death looked like it could have been the result of that ongoing medical condition. A closer look told a very different story. An autopsy revealed that Latempa had a massive amount of medication in his system, far beyond anything that could be explained by a normal dose taken for gallstone pain. New York City's chief toxicologist at the time, Alexander Gettler, made the determination. Gettler was one of the most respected forensic scientists in the country during this era, having spent decades building the city's medical examiner's toxicology laboratory into one of the most advanced of its kind, and his findings had already helped convict or clear suspects in a long list of notable poisoning cases going back to the 1920s. When a man with Gettler's reputation and experience stated that the amount of medication found in Latempa's body was enough to kill 8 horses, it carried real scientific weight, rather than being a casual exaggeration. This was not language a careful scientist would use lightly, and it left little room to believe the overdose had been some kind of ordinary accident. Despite the obvious suspicion surrounding his death, no one was ever arrested or charged for tampering with Latempa's medication or otherwise causing his death. Officially, the case remained unsolved, but the timing left a strong impression on almost everyone following the story. Latempa had been alive and cooperating with prosecutors as long as Genovese remained safely out of the country. The moment Genovese's return became official, Latempa asked for protection, and within a little over a week of receiving it, he was dead. What made this even more remarkable was the timing relative to Genovese's own movements. Latempa died in mid-January 1945, months before Genovese himself actually set foot back on American soil in June of that year. The single witness whose corroborating testimony the prosecution needed most was gone before the man he was set to testify against had even physically returned to the country to face him. Whether this was coincidence, as an accidental overdose theoretically could have been, or something arranged well in advance by people still loyal to Genovese even while he sat in custody overseas, it accomplished exactly what it needed to accomplish for the defense. After Genovese's arraignment in June 1945, the case moved slowly through the legal system for almost a full year before actually going to trial. When the trial finally began in Kings County in June 1946, prosecutors were left in a difficult position. Their case still had Rupolo, who was prepared to testify in detail about how Genovese had ordered Boccia's killing over the dispute involving money from the rigged card game. But the law's requirement for independent corroboration of an accomplice's testimony had not gone away, and with Latempa dead, prosecutors no longer had the second witness they needed to satisfy that legal requirement. The trial was presided over by Judge Samuel Leibowitz, a well-known figure in New York's legal system at the time. Before becoming a judge, Leibowitz had built his reputation as one of the country's most prominent defense attorneys, having gained national attention in the 1930s for defending the group of young black men known as the Scottsboro Boys, who had been wrongly accused of rape in Alabama, in a case that became a landmark in the history of American civil rights and criminal justice. By the time of Genovese's trial, Leibowitz had moved from the defense table to the bench, developing a reputation on the other side of the courtroom as a judge who ran a tight, no-nonsense trial and was not shy about sharing his own view of a case from the bench. Rupolo took the stand and testified just as prosecutors expected, laying out his account of the murder and Genovese's role in ordering it. Once the prosecution finished presenting its case, however, Judge Leibowitz made a decision that ended the trial before it ever reached a jury verdict. He granted a directed verdict of acquittal, ruling that despite Rupolo's detailed testimony, the prosecution had failed to provide the independent corroboration the law required to support a conviction. In doing so, Leibowitz made his own view of the situation clear from the bench. He told the courtroom that while he could not speak for what a jury might have decided, he believed that if there had been even a small piece of corroborating evidence, Genovese would have been sentenced to the electric chair. That comment captured the frustration that ran through the entire case. Prosecutors and the judge overseeing the trial clearly believed Rupolo's account was credible, and the judge said so plainly and publicly. But belief was not the same as legal proof under the rules governing accomplice testimony. And without a second witness like Latempa to back up what Rupolo said, the case could not legally move forward, regardless of what anyone in that courtroom personally thought had actually happened. Genovese was formally acquitted on June 10, 1946, and released from custody the following day. After nearly a decade spent dodging the Boccia murder charge, first by fleeing the country entirely, then by weathering a fugitive investigation in wartime Italy, Genovese walked out of the courtroom a free man, cleared of a killing that most of the people involved in prosecuting the case seemed to believe he had actually ordered. For Ernest Rupolo, testifying against Genovese did not bring him any lasting safety, even though the trial itself had ended in acquittal rather than conviction. After the trial concluded, Rupolo petitioned the court for early release from the protective custody he had been placed in as part of his cooperation with prosecutors. Authorities warned him against this, making clear they believed his life would be in serious danger if he left that protection, given what he had done by testifying against a man as powerful and connected as Genovese. Rupolo chose to leave protective custody anyway, and one newspaper account from the period summed up the general expectations surrounding his decision, suggesting that everyone involved, including Rupolo himself, understood he was now a marked man unlikely to survive for long. Rupolo managed to live for nearly 2 more decades after making that choice, but the danger those warnings pointed to eventually caught up with him. On August 24, 1964, his body was recovered from Jamaica Bay in Queens, a large tidal bay along the southern edge of the borough that, over the decades, had developed an unfortunate reputation in New York crime history as a convenient place to dispose of a body, thanks to its size, its relative distance from dense residential areas at the time, and the way its currents and marshy edges could keep something hidden for a long while before it was ever found. Whoever killed Rupolo had tied his hands and attached 2 concrete blocks to his legs before putting him in the water, a method meant to make sure the body would sink and stay hidden. It was widely believed at the time, and has remained the general assumption among historians of the case ever since, that Genovese finally ordered Rupolo's death as payback for testifying against him decades earlier in the Boccia case. If that belief is accurate, it suggests Genovese did not forget the betrayal and simply waited, patiently and without any apparent hurry, until the moment felt right to settle the score for good. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the time Genovese walked free from that Brooklyn courtroom in June 1946, he had survived a war-era arrest in Italy, a wartime black market investigation, an extradition process that dragged on for months, and a murder trial built on testimony that everyone in the room seemed to find convincing, but that the law could not fully act on. He returned to New York with his reputation inside the underworld fully intact, and in some ways strengthened, since surviving this kind of legal ordeal without a conviction only added to the sense that Genovese was a man who always seemed to find a way out. What he found waiting for him back in New York, however, was an organization still run by other men, and a set of rivals standing between him and the kind of complete control he had wanted for years. Getting there would mean removing those men, one by one, the same way he had helped remove Masseria and Maranzano more than a decade earlier. Section 7. Clearing the board. Moretti, Costello, Anastasia. After walking free from the Boccia murder trial in 1946, Vito Genovese returned to New York with his standing inside the underworld fully restored, but he was still not the man in charge. Frank Costello had run the organization Luciano built while Genovese was gone, first during Genovese's years hiding in Italy, and then during the years Luciano himself spent in prison and later exile. Genovese wanted that position for himself, and over the following decade, he moved with patience and calculation to remove the men standing in his way, one at a time, until there was no one left strong enough to stop him. The first man to fall was Willie Moretti, an underboss who had spent years serving as one of Frank Costello's closest allies and right-hand men. Moretti had grown up in East Harlem as a neighbor of Costello and had built a long career running gambling operations out of New Jersey. He was also, according to mafia lore, connected to a well-known story involving singer Frank Sinatra, in which Moretti reportedly pressured bandleader Tommy Dorsey into releasing Sinatra from a restrictive recording contract. Moretti's real trouble began in 1950 and 1951, when the United States Senate ran a nationally televised investigation into organized crime known as the Kefauver Committee. The committee was formally called the Special Committee to Investigate Organized Crime in Interstate Commerce, and it was led by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, who used the hearings to build his own national political profile at the same time he was exposing the reach of organized crime across the country. The committee traveled to a series of major cities, holding hearings that were broadcast live on the still fairly new medium of television, and the sight of known mob figures being questioned on camera drew enormous audiences, turning obscure mobsters into recognizable faces almost overnight. While many mob figures called before the committee refused to answer questions by invoking their right against self-incrimination, Moretti did the opposite. He talked openly, joked with the senators, and treated his appearance almost like a performance, at one point responding to a question about mafia membership by joking about whether the senators were asking if he carried a membership card. Moretti's performance may have entertained the television audience, but it alarmed the men running organized crime across the country. By this point, Moretti was also known to be suffering from an advanced case of syphilis, a condition that had begun to affect his mental state and made him increasingly unpredictable. According to later accounts, including testimony from Joseph Valachi, Genovese told Valachi directly that Moretti was losing his mind, and that killing him would essentially be a mercy killing, sparing him a slow mental decline, while also removing the risk that he might say something far more damaging in the future. On October 4, 1951, Moretti sat down for lunch with 4 other men at a restaurant called Joe's Elbow Room in Cliffside Park, New Jersey. The group was talking and joking in Italian when, at around 11:28 in the morning, gunfire erupted. When restaurant staff came out to check, they found Moretti dead on the floor, shot in the face and head. The other men who had been sitting with him were gone. No one was ever arrested or convicted for his murder, and the killing was widely understood at the time to have been approved by Genovese and the Mafia's commission. With Moretti gone, Costello lost one of his most loyal allies, but he remained the boss of the family and still held real power. Costello's own legal troubles mounted throughout the early and mid-1950s, adding further pressure to his position, even without Genovese lifting a finger. In August 1952, Costello was convicted of contempt after walking out of a Senate hearing and served time in prison for it. In 1954, he was convicted again, this time on tax evasion charges, and sentenced to 5 years, though that conviction was later overturned on appeal after he had already served part of the sentence. In 1956, Costello was convicted once more and sent back to prison, only to be released again on appeal in early 1957. Each of these legal battles chipped away at Costello's ability to fully run his organization, even as he continued fighting to hold on to his position at the top. Genovese found another opening in 1956, when Joe Adonis, a powerful ally of Costello's going back to the earliest days of Masseria's organization, chose to accept voluntary deportation to Italy rather than face a long prison sentence in the United States. Adonis's departure removed one more experienced and loyal supporter from Costello's side, leaving him increasingly isolated at a moment when Genovese was actively working to build support for a takeover. By early 1957, with Costello freshly released from his latest prison stint and weakened both legally and politically within the organization, Genovese decided the time had finally come to make his move directly against him. On the evening of May 2, 1957, Costello returned to his home at the Majestic Apartments on Central Park West in Manhattan, a large twin-towered luxury apartment building completed in 1930 and known for attracting a wealthy and sometimes famous clientele, including entertainers and business figures who valued its size, its views over Central Park, and its discreet reputation among people who preferred not to be bothered. As he crossed the lobby heading toward the elevator, a man stepped forward with a revolver. That man was Vincent Gigante, a young protege and driver working under Genovese, who had reportedly trained for the job at an underground shooting range in Greenwich Village. Gigante called out, saying something to the effect of, "This is for you, Frank," and fired a single shot before fleeing the scene. The warning in Gigante's own words worked against him. Hearing his name called, Costello instinctively turned his head at the exact moment the bullet was fired, and the shot only grazed his scalp, passing close enough to leave a mark on the brim of his hat, but causing nothing more than a minor wound. Gigante, believing he had killed Costello, left the building thinking the job was finished. Costello survived, but the message landed all the same. Rather than fight back or seek revenge, Costello effectively surrendered his position, agreeing to step back from running the organization's day-to-day operations and easing into retirement from the rackets altogether. When the case against Gigante went to trial, Costello refused to identify him as the shooter, despite a doorman at the building having identified Gigante to police, and Gigante was acquitted of attempted murder. With that single shot, botched as it was, Genovese effectively took control of the organization that had once belonged to Luciano, without needing to finish the job of killing Costello at all. One obstacle remained standing between Genovese and complete control, and that obstacle was Albert Anastasia. Anastasia led a powerful faction with deep roots in Brooklyn's waterfront rackets and had once run an enforcement group known within the underworld as Murder Incorporated. a loosely organized crew of hitmen, based largely out of Brooklyn, that carried out contract killings on behalf of mafia bosses around the country from the late 1920s through the early 1940s, with estimates of the total number of murders it carried out ranging from several hundred into the low thousands, depending on which historical account is consulted. Anastasia had been furious over the attempt on Costello's life, since Costello was an ally of his, and he reportedly threatened serious retaliation against Genovese in the aftermath. For a brief period, it looked as though the incident might spiral into a wider war between factions. According to multiple accounts, the other families on the commission stepped in and offered assurances that no further bloodshed would follow, and the immediate threat of open warfare passed, at least on the surface. Rather than continuing to press the issue, Anastasia turned his attention toward expanding his own interests in Cuban casino operations, working alongside Santo Traficante, while quietly building a large home in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Behind the scenes, Genovese was not finished. He worked to secure the support of Carlo Gambino, one of Anastasia's own underboss-level allies, in a plan to remove Anastasia from power entirely. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia went to get a shave and haircut at a barbershop owned by Arthur Grasso, located inside the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. He settled into a barber's chair with a hot towel placed over his face, while his bodyguard and driver, Anthony Coppola, was nowhere nearby, having dropped Anastasia off before parking the car and never returning to his post. With his face covered and his back turned toward the door, Anastasia had no warning when two men entered the shop with scarves pulled up over their faces and opened fire. Reports from the time vary on the exact number of shots fired, with some accounts describing 5 bullets and others describing as many as 10, but the wounds were serious enough that some struck Anastasia in the head while others tore through his back, hip, lung, and other organs. In the chaos of the attack, Anastasia rose from the chair and lunged toward his attackers, but in his confusion, he ended up charging at their reflections in the shop's mirrors rather than the gunmen themselves. He collapsed to the floor and died at the scene. Despite 14 eyewitnesses present in the barbershop that morning, and roughly 100 detectives eventually assigned to investigate, no one was ever arrested or charged for the killing. Investigators did recover one of the weapons used in the attack the following day, discarded in a trash can outside the hotel, but that evidence never led to a conviction. The case remains officially unsolved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With Moretti dead, Costello retired and silenced, and Anastasia removed entirely, Genovese had cleared every major obstacle standing between himself and full control of what had once been Luciano's organization. He had spent roughly a decade working patiently toward this exact outcome, using a mix of violence, political maneuvering inside the commission, and simple patience while waiting for his rivals to weaken on their own. What Genovese did next, moving quickly to consolidate and formalize this new power, would end up drawing far more attention from law enforcement than he ever could have wanted, setting in motion the very investigation that would eventually bring his career crashing down. Section 8. Appalachian. The Summit That Backfired. By late 1957, Vito Genovese had removed nearly every obstacle standing between himself and full control of organized crime in New York. Willie Moretti was dead. Frank Costello had backed away from power after surviving an assassination attempt, and Albert Anastasia had been shot dead in a Manhattan barbershop just weeks earlier. With his rivals gone or sidelined, Genovese wanted to formalize his new position, not just among the New York families, but across the entire national network of organized crime groups that operated throughout the United States and beyond. To do that, he called for a large gathering of top mob figures from around the country, a summit meant to confirm the new balance of power, divide up territory and rackets that had belonged to Anastasia, and settle any outstanding disputes before they could turn into open conflict. The location chosen for this meeting was the rural estate of Joseph Barbara, a man known within the underworld as Joe the Barber, located in the small town of Appalachian, New York, roughly 200 miles northwest of New York City, near the Pennsylvania border. Barbara owned a soft drink distribution business as a legitimate front and had a criminal record that reportedly included murder charges from earlier in his life. His property, spread across more than 50 acres, had already hosted a similar large meeting the year before, in 1956, and this history meant that at least one local law enforcement officer had already developed an interest in keeping an eye on Barbara's activities. That officer was New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell, who had been watching Barbara for years, suspecting him of continued ties to organized crime, and possibly bootlegging as well. On November 13, 1957, the day before the planned meeting, Croswell and his partner, investigator Vincent Vasisco, happened to be at a nearby motel investigating an unrelated complaint about a bad check. While there, they overheard Barbara's adult son booking a block of rooms, reportedly describing the reservation as being for a convention connected to Canada Dry, the soft drink brand tied to the family's legitimate business. Croswell found this suspicious enough to spend the rest of that day watching Barbara's home, his bottling plant, and the nearby motel, and he brought in 2 federal Treasury agents, Arthur Houston and Kenneth Brown, to help keep watch. The meeting itself took place the following day, November 14, 1957. Approximately 100 men gathered at Barbara's estate, having traveled from across the United States, as well as from Cuba and Italy, arriving in a long procession of expensive, late-model cars, many of them Cadillacs. The agenda for the gathering reportedly covered a wide range of organized crime business, including how to handle the gambling and narcotics interests Anastasia had once controlled in Cuba, ongoing questions about the international narcotics trade more broadly, and rackets tied to New York's garment industry, including loan sharking arrangements with business owners and control over trucking operations in the garment district. At around 12:40 in the afternoon, Croswell, Vasisco, and the 2 Treasury agents parked an unmarked car outside Barbara's large stone house, watching the property from a distance. The sheer number of expensive out-of-state cars parked along the property's private road immediately caught their attention, and when Croswell ran the license plates through police channels, every single one came back registered to someone with a known criminal record. Recognizing that something far bigger than a beverage distributor's business meeting was taking place, Croswell called in additional support and set up roadblocks on the roads leading away from the estate, hoping to identify and stop as many attendees as possible once they tried to leave. As word spread inside the house that police were watching the property, the meeting dissolved into chaos. Men in tailored suits, carrying pockets full of cash, and wearing expensive jewelry, scattered in every direction. Some tried to simply drive away and were stopped directly at the roadblocks Croswell's team had set up. Others abandoned their cars entirely and ran on foot through the surrounding fields and woods, with some losing their shoes in the mud as they fled. The image of powerful, wealthy organized crime figures running through the countryside, in ruined dress shoes and suits, became one of the most enduring and almost comical details associated with the entire event, even though the consequences that followed were anything but funny for the men involved. In the end, out of the roughly 100 men believed to have attended, somewhere between 58 and 62 were caught and arrested, depending on which historical account is consulted. Those taken into custody included some of the most powerful names in American organized crime at the time, among them Vito Genovese himself, Carlo Gambino, Joseph Profaci, Joseph Bonanno, and figures connected to organized crime interests in Florida and Cuba, including Santo Trafficante. Many others managed to escape through the woods before police could identify or detain them, but the sheer number and importance of the men who were caught made this raid unlike anything law enforcement had previously managed to pull off against organized crime in the United States. In the months that followed, 20 of the men arrested at Appalachian were initially convicted on charges related to conspiring to commit perjury and obstructing justice, largely stemming from their refusal to give police straight answers about why they had gathered at Barbara's estate in the first place. These convictions did not hold up for long. The following year, all of them were overturned on appeal, and in the end, none of the men caught at Appalachian served any meaningful prison time directly connected to their presence at the meeting itself. Even so, Sergeant Croswell later remarked that the raid had accomplished something valuable regardless of the legal outcome, comparing the effect to throwing the mobsters up in the air where everyone could take a shot at them, meaning the publicity and scrutiny that followed mattered even without convictions attached. That scrutiny turned out to be enormous, and its effects reached far beyond the men who had actually been arrested that day. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly downplayed or outright denied that a coordinated, national organized crime network existed in the United States, preferring to direct FBI resources toward other priorities. The spectacle of dozens of the country's most powerful criminal figures gathering in one place, then fleeing through the woods when confronted by police, made that denial impossible to maintain. Roughly 2 weeks after the raid, Hoover's FBI launched what became known as the Top Hoodlum Program, directing field offices across the country to identify and build cases against top organized crime figures in their areas. This shift in federal attention marked one of the most significant turning points in the history of American law enforcement's approach to organized crime, and it traced directly back to the embarrassment of the Appalachian Raid. For Genovese personally, the meeting he had called specifically to cement his new position as the dominant force in organized crime ended up becoming one of the worst possible outcomes he could have imagined. Rather than confirming his authority quietly and efficiently, the raid placed his name, along with dozens of others, directly in newspaper headlines across the country, and squarely in the sights of a newly energized FBI. Some historians and mob associates have long speculated that this outcome was not entirely accidental. 3 of the most senior and experienced figures in American organized crime, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky, were all notably absent from the Appalachian meeting, despite their long-standing influence over the very organization Genovese was trying to formally take charge of. According to this theory, the 3 men may have deliberately tipped off authorities about the gathering, understanding that a meeting of that size and importance was likely to attract exactly the kind of attention it ultimately did, all as a way of undermining Genovese's takeover before it could ever be fully secured. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Whether or not that theory is accurate, and no definitive proof has ever settled the question one way or the other, the practical effect on Genovese was the same either way. He had spent years patiently removing every rival standing in his way, only to see his moment of triumph turn into a public disaster that placed him and his entire network under a level of federal scrutiny they had never faced before. The Appalachian meeting did not immediately end Genovese's career, but it marked the beginning of a period of law enforcement attention that would eventually catch up with him in a far more permanent way, through a criminal case that had nothing to do with murder or backroom mob politics, and everything to do with the drug trafficking operations he had helped build over the course of his career. Section 9. The narcotics case that buried him. In the aftermath of the disastrous Appalachian meeting, federal law enforcement turned its attention toward organized crime with a level of focus it had never shown before, and Vito Genovese found himself squarely in the crosshairs of that new attention. The case that would eventually end his career on the streets did not come from a rival gunman or a Senate hearing. It came from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, working through an informant whose credibility would be questioned for decades afterward, even as the case against Genovese moved forward with remarkable speed and determination. At the center of the case was a man named Nelson Cantellops, a Puerto Rican drug dealer with a history of heroin addiction himself. Cantellops claimed to have direct, personal knowledge of Genovese's involvement in narcotics trafficking, going so far as to say that he had personally met with Genovese to discuss drug transactions. Given how seriously this kind of testimony could damage a case if it fell apart under cross-examination, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics reportedly spent a full year screening Cantellops and checking his account for accuracy before ever bringing the case to a federal grand jury. Only after that lengthy vetting process did agents move forward with seeking indictments against Genovese and a long list of his associates. On July 7, 1958, narcotics agents from the U.S. Treasury Department arrested Genovese at his home on Highland Avenue in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. He was named in a sealed indictment alongside longtime associates Vincent Gigante and Carmine Galante, along with a much larger group of defendants connected to the alleged conspiracy. In total, agents arrested Genovese and 53 other defendants that day, with 14 additional co-conspirators named in the case as well. Of this large group, only Genovese and 16 others were formally indicted and brought to trial. 2 of those indicted, Galante and a man named John Ormento, managed to avoid arrest for a period of time and did not appear in court when the case first went to trial. The charges against Genovese and his co-defendants centered on conspiracy to import, conceal, and sell narcotics, specifically heroin, in violation of federal drug laws. The case went to trial on January 5, 1959, in federal court in the Southern District of New York, with Judge Alexander Bix presiding. Cantellops took the stand as the government's central witness, describing his claimed personal interactions with Genovese and laying out an account that directly tied the reputed crime boss to the drug conspiracy at the heart of the case. From the very beginning, serious doubts surrounded Cantelops and the strength of his testimony. Several court observers and organized crime experts at the time believed he was lying, or at the very least exaggerating his level of direct contact with Genovese. Their skepticism rested on a simple and well-established pattern in how organized crime bosses typically operated. Men in Genovese's position spent their entire careers building layers of insulation between themselves and the actual criminal transactions carried out by their organizations, relying on underlings to handle the details of any given deal specifically so that the boss himself could never be directly tied to the crime. Critics of the case pointed out that it would have been wildly out of character for a man as experienced and careful as Genovese to personally involve himself in a drug transaction the way Cantelops described. Some historians have drawn a direct comparison to Lucky Luciano's own narcotics-related conviction decades earlier, in 1936, on charges of running a prostitution ring, noting that similar questions about the strength and believability of the evidence used against Luciano had circulated at the time as well. Despite these doubts, the case moved forward to a verdict. On April 3, 1959, a jury found Genovese and 14 other defendants guilty of conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws. In the days following the verdict, nationally syndicated newspaper columnist Dorothy Kilgallen reported that figures within the underworld expected Genovese to receive a relatively light sentence, somewhere around 2.5 years, and that he seemed more or less at peace with that outcome. That expectation turned out to be badly mistaken. On April 17, 1959, Judge Bix sentenced Genovese to 15 years in federal prison and fined him $20,000, a punishment far harsher than what Genovese and the people around him had anticipated. At 62 years old, Genovese addressed the judge directly before sentencing, telling him simply that all he could say was that he was innocent. The judge was unmoved, immediately revoking Genovese's bail and taking him into custody on the spot. Public reaction to the sentence, at least in the local New Jersey community where Genovese had been living, was largely unsympathetic. On May 1, 1959, an editorial in the Asbury Park Press ran under the headline "Good Riddance," stating plainly that while Monmouth County counted Genovese among its residents, it was in no way interested in boasting about that fact. The sentiment reflected just how much notoriety Genovese's name had accumulated by this point, both from his decades in organized crime and from the very public spectacle of the Appalachian meeting less than 2 years earlier. Genovese did not go straight to prison after his conviction. He was released on bail while his legal team pursued an appeal, taking the case all the way up through the federal court system. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately upheld the conviction in a ruling connected to the broader case, known as United States v. Avalos, rejecting arguments that the evidence against Genovese personally had been insufficient to support the verdict. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear a further appeal, denying certiorari in 1960. Genovese's appeal was formally rejected on January 12, 1960, and with no further legal options left to delay the outcome, he was ordered to begin serving his 15-year sentence. Even facing the certainty of a long prison term, Genovese did not simply walk away from control of his organization. Before he was taken into custody to begin serving his sentence, he set up a ruling panel made up of 3 trusted, high-ranking members of his family, identified in historical accounts by the surnames Strollo, Catena, and Miranda, to oversee day-to-day operations while he was locked away. This arrangement allowed Genovese to maintain a functioning chain of command without needing to hand over full authority to any single successor, and it reflected the same careful, controlled approach to power that had defined his entire career. Genovese continued exercising real influence over his organization from behind bars, reportedly passing messages in and out of prison to issue orders on matters ranging from territorial disputes to internal discipline among his own men. As with the Appalachian meeting, questions have persisted for decades over whether Genovese's narcotics conviction was entirely what it appeared to be on the surface. Some historians and researchers have pointed to the same group of men suspected of helping engineer the Appalachian raid, namely Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky, as possible behind-the-scenes contributors to Genovese's downfall in this case as well. The theory holds that these older, more experienced figures, all of whom had reason to resent Genovese's ruthless climb to power over the preceding decade, may have had a hand in either producing or supporting the witness testimony that ultimately convicted him. No definitive proof has ever confirmed this theory, and it remains speculation rather than established fact. But the pattern of Genovese's two biggest legal disasters, both potentially tracing back to men he had personally pushed aside on his way to the top, has struck many students of mafia history as more than mere coincidence. Genovese began serving his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, the same facility where Frank Costello himself would later serve time on a separate contempt charge, resulting in the strange circumstance of two men who had once been locked in a violent power struggle, spending time incarcerated together under the same roof. Genovese was later transferred to the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, continuing to serve out his sentence there. Despite his advancing age and his physical removal from the streets of New York, Genovese remained the acknowledged head of his organization throughout this period, a boss in exile, rather than a boss stripped of power. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What Genovese could not control from inside prison, however, was the growing unease among some of his own men, unease that would soon turn into the very kind of betrayal Genovese had built his entire career punishing in others. A fellow inmate serving time alongside him was about to become convinced that Genovese wanted him dead, and the panic that followed would end with the collapse of the mafia's decades-old code of silence, playing out in front of the entire country on national television. Section 10. The Kiss of Death and the Fall of Omerta. By the early 1960s, Vito Genovese had spent several years locked away in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, serving out his 15-year sentence on the narcotics conspiracy conviction that had ended his time running the streets of New York directly. Even behind bars, Genovese continued to hold real influence over his organization, passing instructions to trusted men on the outside and maintaining his position as the acknowledged boss, despite his physical confinement. It was inside that same prison, among the general population of inmates, that Genovese crossed paths with a lower-ranking member of his own organization, whose fate would end up sealing the collapse of the mafia's decades-old code of silence. That man was Joseph Valachi, a soldier-level member of the organization that had once belonged to Lucky Luciano and was now known as the Genovese family. Valachi had spent decades involved in numbers rackets and gambling operations going back to the 1930s, never rising particularly high within the organization's ranks. In 1959, around the same time federal prosecutors were building their case against Genovese, Valachi was separately convicted of narcotics violations and sentenced to a term of 15 to 20 years in prison. He ended up serving that sentence in the same federal penitentiary in Atlanta, where Genovese was already incarcerated, placing the two men, boss and low-ranking soldier, inside the same walls. Tensions inside the prison began building around Valachi sometime after his arrival. According to later accounts, a fellow inmate named Vito Genovese, who harbored personal grievances tied to his brother's death and a related dispute involving a Genovese associate named Stefano Magaddino, may have spread word suggesting that Valachi had become an informant working with federal narcotics agents. Whether or not this accusation had any real basis in fact, it spread among the prisoners connected to organized crime, and Valachi soon noticed a growing coldness from men who had once treated him as a trusted member of the family. Other inmates avoided him, conversations stopped when he approached, and at least one incident saw a fellow prisoner shout accusations at him directly in front of other mob-connected inmates, calling him an informer to his face. By June of 1962, Valachi believed he had already survived 3 separate attempts on his life inside the prison. According to Valachi's own later account, given after he had already begun cooperating with federal investigators, one evening in the cell he shared with Genovese and several other inmates, following a long and rambling conversation, Genovese suddenly leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. One of the other men in the cell, a younger inmate named Ralph Wagner, reportedly told Valachi afterward that he had just received what was known in mafia tradition as the kiss of death, a symbolic gesture understood to mean that the person receiving it had been marked for execution. It is worth noting that this specific account of the kiss comes entirely from Valachi's own retelling of events after he had already decided to cooperate with authorities, meaning it cannot be independently verified the way a witnessed crime or a court record can be, though it became a central and widely repeated part of the story surrounding his decision to turn informant. Valachi also later claimed that Genovese had placed a bounty of $100,000 on his life, though this figure, like the kiss itself, rests on Valachi's own word rather than independent confirmation. Convinced that his life was in immediate danger and that the threat was not going away, Valachi grew increasingly paranoid inside the prison. On the morning of June 22, 1962, while out in the courtyard at the Atlanta Penitentiary, Valachi noticed a group of men loitering behind the prison's baseball grandstand. The men appeared to be watching him, and as they began moving in his direction, Valachi became convinced they were coming to kill him. He grabbed a length of iron pipe, roughly 2 feet long, lying near an ongoing construction project in the yard, and as the group passed by him, he struck first, targeting a man he believed to be Joseph Di Palermo, a mob associate known on the street as Joe Beck, who Valachi suspected of being one of the men sent to carry out his killing. Valachi had made a fatal mistake. The man he beat was not Di Palermo at all, but a prisoner named John Joseph Saup, a career criminal with a background in forgery, mail theft, and bank robbery who had no connection whatsoever to organized crime. Saup simply happened to bear a strong physical resemblance to Di Palermo. Valachi struck him repeatedly with the pipe, fracturing his skull and beating him badly enough that Saup fell unconscious to the ground. Guards intervened and restrained Valachi before he could do any further harm, and Saup was taken for medical treatment, but the injuries proved too severe. He remained in a coma for roughly 2 days before dying from the attack. Valachi now found himself in an extraordinarily dangerous position on 2 separate fronts. Genovese, according to Valachi's account, still believed him to be an informant and still wanted him dead regardless of what had just happened in the prison yard. At the same time, Valachi now faced a fresh murder charge for killing a man who had no connection to the underworld at all, a mistake that left him facing the possibility of the death penalty on top of everything else. With threats closing in from both the mafia and the American justice system at once, Valachi made the decision that would end his career in organized crime and permanently alter how the American public understood the mafia's existence. He began speaking privately with FBI agents, trading detailed information about the internal structure and operations of the Genovese family, in exchange for protection from retaliation, and an agreement that prosecutors would not seek his execution for Saup's killing. In the end, Valachi received a life sentence for the murder, rather than the death penalty, a direct result of his cooperation with federal authorities. What followed became one of the most significant moments in the history of American law enforcement's fight against organized crime. From September 25 through October 9, 1963, Valachi testified publicly before the United States Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator John McClellan. His appearance marked the first time a fully initiated member of the American Mafia had ever publicly acknowledged the organization's existence, laying out its internal hierarchy, its rituals, and the structure of its 5 major New York families in testimony that was broadcast to a national audience. Valachi's testimony is widely credited with popularizing the term Cosa Nostra as the name used to describe the American Mafia, a term that entered common public use largely because of his appearance before the Senate. Valachi's account was not without its problems, and honest histories of the case need to reflect that reality, rather than treating every word of his testimony as established fact. Portions of what he described relied on second-hand information and hearsay rather than direct personal knowledge, particularly regarding events and figures above his own relatively low rank within the organization. His testimony required extensive preparation and coaching from Justice Department officials beforehand, and prosecutors themselves raised concerns about whether certain parts of his account would hold up as reliable evidence in an actual courtroom setting. Some of his contemporaries in law enforcement and organized crime research viewed portions of his story as exaggerated, possibly inflated, to make himself appear more important or more central to events than he actually had been, a motivation that would have made sense given how much his own safety and legal outcome depended on how valuable his cooperation appeared to the government. Even accounting for these limitations, the broader picture Valachi provided about the mafia's organizational structure, its code of conduct, and the existence of a coordinated national criminal network held up as genuinely useful information, and it gave law enforcement a foundation for understanding organized crime that had simply not existed in any public form before his testimony. For Genovese, the entire episode represented a strange and almost ironic final chapter to a career built on ruthless control and calculated violence. A mistaken suspicion, whether accurate or not, had set off a chain of events that led directly to the collapse of the very code of silence that men in his position had depended on for decades to protect themselves and their organizations from exactly this kind of public exposure. Genovese remained in federal prison through the rest of the 1960s, continuing to serve his sentence as his health declined with age. On February 14, 1969, Genovese died of a heart attack at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 71 years old and had served approximately 10 years of his 15-year sentence at the time of his death. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, closing out a life that had carried him from a poor immigrant childhood on Mulberry Street to the very top of American organized crime, and finally into a federal prison cell, where he died still holding the title of boss, even if the empire he had spent decades building and defending was, by then, already coming apart at the seams. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.